Everybody, if you've got your Bibles, you might turn to the Book of Nehemiah. And we're going to start looking tonight at chapter 9, and we'll try to finish out the book tonight as we've been studying this part of Bible history. So the Coxes had to be out for tonight, and so I'm going to try to remember if I can know how to teach a class all on my own without Colby's help. So it's been a minute since I've done that, but we come to Nehemiah chapter 9. So in the Bible story, what period are we in? What's happening at this moment? Return and rebuilding. That's how we've summarized this period of Bible history. So the people of Judah went into captivity because of their unfaithfulness to God. We're going to talk about some of that tonight, especially in chapter 9. They were unfaithful to God. They go into captivity. They're there for 70 years. This is when we read about Daniel and Ezekiel and other characters in captivity. They are there, and then in the years following, so the year 536 BC, Cyrus comes to the throne in Persia and allows people from all different nations to go back to their homeland, which will include the people of Judah. So 536 is our first key date when we think about the return and the rebuilding period, because there Cyrus the king is going to allow the people that he's taken captive, including the people of Judah, to go back to their homes. That first wave, that first group of people that go back home to Judah from Persia are led by a man named what? Do you remember? Zerubbabel, that's right. And what's their task? What's the goal that they want to accomplish? They want to rebuild the temple. They want to rebuild the temple. So this was the devastating thing. It happened in 587, 586 BC, that the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Now Cyrus has given the right for those people to go back in 536 with the provision that they can rebuild the temple. However, when they go back to rebuild the temple, they kind of get stalled out for a while. They are not able to finish the job. They get some opposition from some neighboring people. They seem to just lose interest in that. So there's two prophets that come and try to encourage them. What are their names? Haggai and Zechariah. All right, Haggai we have in our Bibles is very short. Zechariah is a little bit longer, but between the two of them, they encourage the people to get back to work rebuilding the temple. That is finished in the year 516 BC. All right, so about 20 years after they make that first return, 516, they rebuild the temple. All right, so now we're going to jump forward. We talked about the story of Esther that happens back in Persia, but about 60 years later, we're in the year 458 BC, there's going to be another major move of Jewish people back to the land of Judah, and they are led by who? This is 458. Ezra. Our second wave is led by Ezra. Now, his goal is not to rebuild anything structurally, it doesn't seem, but he wants to rebuild the people. He wants to get them back to following the law as they're supposed to. Some of the key things that are going on is the intermarriages with some of the idolatrous nations, and it seems to be just an overall focus on the work of the priesthood and that sort of thing. Now, in the book of Nehemiah, he's the leader of that third wave that goes back in 445, and of course we know that Nehemiah's job, that group is going to go back to rebuild what? The wall. The wall is the key thing that they are rebuilding. Now, Nehemiah is not unconcerned about spiritual things as well, but he's able to work with Ezra, who's still there. We're about 13 years after Ezra's gone back, but now we're with Nehemiah. He's focusing on rebuilding the wall, and as a result of that, the people join him in the work, and especially the people of Judah. I like at the beginning of the book, he says the people had a mind to work, and they prove that. In 52 days, they're able to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. They're able to install the gates, and the wall is rebuilt. And we talked about last week in Nehemiah chapter 8, Ezra has a public reading of the Scripture, and not only are the people concerned about the wall, they are concerned that they haven't been following the law to the fullest. They see some areas where they've missed it, and it looks to me like they try to make a 180-degree turn. They try to repent and do what they're supposed to do, and we see that in chapter 8 with a focus on the law. Now, that's going to continue in chapter 9 as we think about that. And then as we work through the book, the end of the book, there are some challenges that come up, and there are some ways that they need to be addressed. Okay, so we've got our three waves. Zerubbabel comes back. They rebuild the temple in 516. Ezra leads a group back in 458. And then Nehemiah is going to lead a big group back in 445. And that's where we find ourselves now. The wall's been rebuilt, and now Nehemiah is there as the governor of Judah, overseeing the people as they express interest in doing better spiritually. Okay. Anything else before we jump into chapter 9? Any questions or concerns that you've got? Comments that you'd like to make? Okay. So now we come to chapter 9. On the 24th day of this month, I think it's the same month that they've just celebrated the Feast of Booths, which was on the 15th day of the 7th month. On the 24th day, they come together, they are fasting, they are in sackcloth, and they have earth on their heads. They are in the picture of still being in a mourning phase. What I mean by that is they are still upset, at least in some way, about their failure to keep the law. So they separated themselves, verse 2, from all foreigners, and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. And they stood up in their place and read from the book of the law of the Lord their God for a quarter of a day. For another quarter of it, they made confession and worshiped the Lord their God. So here we've got another assembly, another gathering, and they're reading God's word for several hours. It says a quarter of a day. I don't know if we're talking about 4 hours. I guess it'd be 6 hours there, but maybe half a day. And then for another quarter of the day, and maybe we're just talking about daylight, I don't know, but we're talking about several hours, 3 or 6 hours. A long time they're reading God's word, and for another large portion of time, they are confessing their sin and they are worshiping God. And that idea of confessing their sin is, I think they are talking, and we'll see this in the prayer that they pray, I think they are talking about God's faithfulness and their unfaithfulness in the face of it. I think that's what they're talking about when they're confessing their sin. They talk about all the things that God has done for them and all the things that they and their ancestors have done in response to that were not right. And so you've got the Levites standing there at the end of verse 5. They said, "Stand up and bless the Lord your God from everlasting to everlasting. Blessed be your glorious name, which is exalted above blessing and praise." And so the Levites call upon the people to praise God, to exalt Him, to lift His name up at this moment. Okay, let's look at this prayer that they pray. It's very interesting to me. It seems to me that basically Nehemiah, well, it's not Nehemiah's prayer. It's kind of this group prayer. I don't know who it is that's wording this. I guess it's the Levites that are kind of leading this prayer. But the interesting thing is they walk basically through the whole story of the Bible. The whole story of the Bible. From verse 6 all the way to verse 15, God is the subject of every sentence. Right? What I mean by that is every sentence from verse 6 to verse 15 is about what God has done. Let's look at that just really briefly. So verse 6, "You are the Lord, you alone. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their hosts, the earth and all that is in it, the seas and all that is in them, and you preserve all them, and the host of heaven worships you." Here he talks about creation. First of all, Nehemiah says, you are the one who made everything. Then verse 7, "You are the Lord, the God who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldees and gave him the name Abraham. You found his heart faithful before you and made with him the covenant to give to his offspring the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite, the Girgashite, and you have kept your promise, for you are righteous." So he starts with creation, then he jumps to Abram, God calling Abram and making a promise, and specifically the promise that God was going to give him the land of Canaan. All right? So that takes us Genesis 1. We've got Genesis 12 there. Then, verse 9, "You saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt and heard their cry at the Red Sea and performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants and all the people of his land. For you knew that they acted arrogantly against our fathers. And you made a name for yourself as it is this day." So he references the Egyptian bondage period. You saw them in slavery. All right, so notice how he's just carrying us through the Bible story. Creation, the call of Abraham, then you see them in Egyptian slavery, and then we come to verse 11, and you divided the sea before them. So they went through the midst of the sea on dry land, and you cast their pursuers into the depths as stone into mighty waters. By a pillar of cloud you led them in the day, and by a pillar of fire in the night to light for them the way which they should go. We're talking about the Exodus. Brought them through the Red Sea, made them come through dry ground, led them with the pillar of fire by night and the cloud by day. Then notice verse 13. You came down on Mount Sinai and spoke to them from heaven and gave them right rules and true laws, good statutes and commandments. And you made known to them your holy Sabbath and commanded them commandments and statutes by a law by Moses your servant. You gave them bread from heaven for their hunger and brought water for them out of the rock for their thirst. And you told them to go in and possess the land that you swore to give them. Here they are coming through the wilderness, headed to the land that God had promised all the way back to Abram. Just think about what he's saying here. You made us. You called Abram. You saw us in our slavery. You rescued us out of that. You led us in the wilderness. You brought us to Mount Sinai. I love the way he describes law. You gave them right rules, true laws, and good statutes. It wasn't just that he gave them random instructions. He gave them right rules, true laws, good instruction. And then you provided for them even in the wilderness. You provided for them bread and water, and you were bringing them right to the brink of the land that you had promised them. But what's the first word of verse 16? But, right? That's a bad word when you see all the good stuff, that's happening, and then you see the word but, right? In the face of verses 6 through 15, where not Nehemiah, but in the book of Nehemiah, where this prayer is focusing on who God is and what He has done, all this good stuff that He had done, and then when we're going to be introduced to the people of Israel, the word is but. In the face of all that, this is what they do. And so our fathers acted presumptuously and stiffened their neck and did not obey your commandments. They refused to obey and were not mindful of the words you performed them, but they stiffened their neck and appointed a leader to return to their slavery in Egypt. You remember this, right? They're about to go into the land and they refuse to go in, and they say, we're going to go back to Egypt. We're going to go back to that slavery because they longed for, what was it, the leeks and the onions and the melons that they had in slavery. How foolish. But I love this at the end of verse 17. But, there's another contrast. You are a God ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and did not forsake them. Notice how the focus will continually be on who God is and what He has done, on the unfaithfulness of the generations of God's people, and then on God's faithfulness even in the face of that unfaithfulness. That is what this prayer is all about. It is about who God is, how terrible the people of Israel and Judah have been, and how faithful God has been even through all of that. And so he'll carry on, he'll say, even when they made a golden calf, you didn't destroy them. This is verse 19. You, in your great mercies, did not forsake them in the wilderness. Verse 20. You gave your good spirit to instruct them, and did not withhold your manna from their mouth, and gave them water for their thirst. 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness, and they lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell. Even when God was punishing them for their failure, for their unwillingness to obey Him, He's still taking care of them during that period of time. He provides for them everything that they need. All right, that takes us all the way through verse 21. Was there anything specifically y'all wanted to point out? Any specific line that I looked over there? All right, but we see the main theme here. Now he's going to come all the way, verses 22 and following, to the conquest period. So we know in our story of our Bibles, we know about Joshua leading them. And he says, you gave them kingdoms and peoples and allotted to them every corner. You kept your promise that you had made to Abraham. Even after they had rebelled, you kept your promise. Look at verse 23. You multiplied their children as the stars of heaven, and you brought them into the land that you had told their fathers to enter and possess. So not only is God keeping His land promise, He's keeping that nation promise that He had made to Abraham, and He's making the descendants of Abraham so numerous, they're like the stars of heaven. You can't count them. And so they went in, they got the land, God gave it to them. And at the end of verse 25, they ate and they were filled and became fat and delighted themselves in your great goodness. They got the land and they were joyful there because God had been faithful to them. He had been good to them all along. But then in verse 26, my word in verse 26 is nevertheless, right? Even in the face of God's continued faithfulness to them, when God basically allows them to inherit the promises, even when they're unfaithful, the text tells us nevertheless. And what it tells us is they rebelled against the law, they killed the prophets, and so they went, this is describing the judges period, and they would turn back and God would save them, and then they would fall back in sin and God would save them. In verse 31, here's another nevertheless. Nevertheless, in your great mercies, you did not make an end of them or forsake them, for you are a gracious and merciful God. So God was faithful. Nevertheless, they wouldn't quit being unfaithful. Nevertheless, you wouldn't quit being good to them. You wouldn't stop being a gracious and good God to them all along. So, look at verse 32. Now, therefore, our God, the great, the mighty, the awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love, let not all the hardship seem little to you that has come upon us, upon our kings, our princes, our priests, our prophets, our fathers, and all your people since the time of the kings of Assyria to this day. You have been righteous in all that has come upon us. For you have dealt faithfully, and we have acted wickedly. Our kings, our princes, our priests, and our fathers have not kept your law or paid attention to your commandments and your warnings that you gave them, even in their own kingdom and amid your great goodness that you gave them. And in the large and rich land that you set before them, they did not serve you. They did not serve you or turn from their wicked works. Behold, we are slaves this day in the land that you gave to our fathers to enjoy its fruit and its gifts. Behold, we are slaves, and its rich yield goes to the king whom you have set over us because of our sins. They rule over our bodies and over our livestock as they please, and we are in great distress. Because of all this, we make a firm commitment in writing on the sealed document are the names of our princes, our Levites, and our priests. We'll notice that in just a second. So they come down and bring it to the present day, and they say, we are in trouble right now. We're in a bad situation. Now, do they blame God and say that He acted unjustly in that? No. They say, you were righteous in doing what you did, in putting us under this judgment, in taking us into captivity, and in being in the distress that we're in right now. You were faithful to what you said. You kept your word even when it came to the judgments that you were going to bring. So now we come to the end of chapter 9, and it says, we are going to make a firm covenant. We're going to make an agreement with one another and with God, and they're going to sign their names on it in the beginning of chapter 10, and then we're going to see what that covenant says at the end of chapter 10. So the prayer here, the confession here, is about God's faithfulness, their unfaithfulness, and God's goodness and grace, even in the face of all that. And then they're going to say, God, we are obligated to do something about all of this. And what they're going to do is they're going to make some agreements about how they're going to try to serve more faithfully. Okay, anything through chapter 9? How many times have they renewed it? Yeah. Lets them come back to renew a covenant. Yeah. Well, I don't know how many times they would have written a document like this and signed it, but it's interesting. There are a number of times, like you just think about during the times of Hezekiah, where it says they observed the Passover in a way that hadn't been observed before. Like they seem to recommit to that. Josiah, when he finds the law, maybe that would be a recommitting period. He often is looking for. He's always looking for the people to, if they will renew the commitment to do so. Yeah. Anything else in chapter 9? All right, so we come to chapter 10, and here are the men who signed the names of the document. You've got Nehemiah the governor is at the top of that list, and then you've got a whole lot of other names that are mentioned there. All the way through verse 27, you've got about 3 names listed per verse. And so those are going to be the ones who sign and agree to this document that we're going to read about at the end of chapter 10. Now, notice this, verse 28. The rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all who had separated themselves from the people of the lands to the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, all who have knowledge and understanding, join with their brothers, their nobles, and enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord, our Lord, and his rules and his statutes. This is verse 30. There's going to be several things that they're going to specifically point out, and we'll need to notice these again later. Verse 30, we will not give our daughters to the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. So foreign marriages is the first thing they specifically address. Verse 31, and if the peoples of the land bring in goods or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath day or on a holy day, and we will forego the crops of the seventh year and the exaction of every debt. All right, so there's the Sabbath day and the Sabbath year that they commit to especially. It's very interesting. The Sabbath day, maybe that was kept well at certain times, maybe it wasn't. The Sabbath year, I don't know that we ever read about it being kept prior to the captivity. In fact, one of the judgments on Judah will be that the land's finally going to get its Sabbaths. The land's finally going to get its rest. And the amazing thing about that Sabbath year is what they were supposed to do is they were supposed to grow food for 6 and let the land lie fallow for year 7, and God would make it produce on its own. But that would require quite a lot of faith, right? It would require a pretty high level of trust in God. I don't know that they never did it, but we never have a record of them doing it. And so it's very interesting that that's one of the things that they specify here. No foreign marriages and no breaking of the Sabbath. The third thing is found in verses 32 and following. We also take on ourselves the obligation to give yearly a third part of a shekel for the service of the house of our God. Now, there's also other things here. Verse 35, we obligate ourselves to bring the first fruits of the ground and the first fruits of all fruit of every tree year by year to the house of the Lord. Also to bring the house of our God, the priests who minister in the house of God, the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, as it is written in the law, and the firstborn of our herds and flocks. Then verse 38, the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites receive the tithes. And then at the very end of verse 39, we will not neglect the house of our God. So basically what Nehemiah is saying is there are various offerings that we have to make. The third of a shekel, the first fruits of the land, the firstborn of our flock. When he talks about the firstborn of our sons, I think that was the thing where they would come and make an offering at that time. Their son didn't have to stay at the temple. That was what God had the Levites for. But they would make an offering. And at the very end of this, he says, we're not going to neglect the house of God. They've rebuilt the temple, but are they going to make the payments to the temple? Are they going to provide the food for the temple, for the priests? Are they going to pay the tithe? And they make a commitment. We're going to do that. So there's 3 key things that they commit to. They commit to no foreign marriages, not going to take their daughters for our sons or give our daughters to their sons. They are going to be committed to the Sabbath day and the Sabbath year, and they're going to make sure that they rightly fund the temple and its service. Those are the 3 things that are being focused on here. Now, that's not all. They say we're going to obey the whole law, right? But these are 3 things that evidently were a problem that they hadn't been focusing on, and they signed specifically, we're going to take care of these things. All right, anything through chapter 10? Anything I looked over you would like to point out? Okay, now we come to chapter 11. Chapter 11. Now this chapter is about some of the leaders in Jerusalem and some of the villages outside of Jerusalem. Look at chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. The leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 out of 10 remained in the other towns. and the people blessed all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. So in verses 1 and 2, what do you see about the idea of living in Jerusalem? What does it seem like is going on in those verses? Nobody wants to, right? Yeah, I think that's what's going on. The leaders are living there, but I'm taking it to be that the leaders have houses to live in, right? I'm taking it to be that they got their houses rebuilt, and they're kind of like in it, maybe even royally funded, build out their houses since they're the leaders, right? We're talking about administrative officials and their houses. But back in chapter 7, we talked about this a little bit the other day. Back in chapter 7 and verse 4, the city was wide and large, but the people within it were few, and no houses had been rebuilt. I take it to be that the ordinary people's houses had not been rebuilt, right? So they had focused on the temple, they had rebuilt it, and then they had focused on rebuilding the wall, but the houses of the ordinary folks hadn't been taken care of, and so they were having to live out in the towns, in the rural communities outside around Jerusalem. But they want the city of Jerusalem to be great, so they kind of have, they cast lots, right? They have a drawing to see who's going to come live in the city. And it seems like some people even volunteer to come live in the city, and everybody is very appreciative of those who will volunteer to come live in the city. And I think the reason people appreciate that is because it's going to take work for them to have to rebuild their house. That's going to take some time and effort and energy to be able to do all of that. That's not going to be as good as already having a house built outside of town because they're having to take extra time. Yes, they are going to be representatives. And so you're going to have representatives from all of these towns who are going to come to live in Jerusalem. And that might also make them a little bit more reliant on people outside to be growing crops. It's not that nobody who lived in the city of Jerusalem was a farmer, but you're going to have a little bit of a harder time being an efficient farmer living in the city than you would have been living outside in one of these towns where you would have access to the fields and things like that. All right, now he's going to list the chiefs who lived in Jerusalem, and he's going to go through those names from verse 3 all the way down to verse 24. Then in verse 25, he's going to talk about the villages that some of the people lived in, Kiriath Arba and its villages, and then we'll go through all of that. And that basically carries us through chapter 11. I don't know if there's anything particularly you want to point out from all of that. If there is, that's great. If there's not, we can move right on to chapter 12. All right, we're not skipping over it except just to say that it's a list of names that I don't want to make a mess of tonight. Okay, then we come to chapter 12. And we've got a list here, beginning in chapter 12 and verse 1. We have a list of the priests and Levites. And the priests and Levites, they are going, some of them will live in town. We'll see this back in chapter 11 a little bit, that some of the temple servants will live just outside of Jerusalem, but they will come to Jerusalem for their work. But they don't necessarily stay there full time. But these are the people that we have that are the priests and Levites. Now notice this, it says they came up with Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua. This would have been 50 years earlier. So I don't know if we're talking about those people were still being alive, or these are just the ones that came just so that we have a record so that they could look back and find who was supposed to be the priests and the Levites in their own time. It seems to me that if they had come with Zerubbabel and Shealtiel and Zerubbabel and Jeshua 50 years earlier, it would be hard to imagine that all of these people were still there if they had been serving as priests and Levites at that time. We're way down the road from that. Anyway, so this says in verse 26, these were in the days of Joachim, the son of Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, in the days of Nehemiah, the governor, and of Ezra, the priest and the scribe. So it seems as like once we get down to verses 22 and following, maybe there we're looking at more modern day ones. Okay. All right, any thoughts through the beginning of chapter 12? All right, let's do some more reading at the end of chapter 12 then. This is verse 27. And at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, with thanksgiving, with singing, with cymbals, harps, and lyres. And the sons of the singers gathered together from the districts surrounding Jerusalem and from the villages of the Netophathites, also from Beth Gilgal and from the region of Geba and Asmaveth. For the singers had built for themselves villages around Jerusalem, and the priests and the Levites purified themselves, and they purified the people and the gates and the wall. So there's this great dedication ceremony that they have for the wall. I think in this dedication ceremony, there is a recognition of their uniqueness as God's people, of the blessing that God has given them in being able to do this. And that's why they have this purification ritual. They purify the people, they purify the wall. This is a place that's set apart for God. And so they are indicating that not only in the temple, but even the walls and the people of Jerusalem. I think they are trying to demonstrate how serious they are about being faithful to God. And so you've got all these people gathering together. Verse 31, I brought the leaders of Judah up onto the wall and appointed 2 great choirs that gave thanks. We've seen that several times there, right? Back up in verse 27 with thanksgivings and singing. Now they bring choirs to give thanks. Verse 38, the other choir of those who gave thanks went north. Verse 40, both choirs of those who gave thanks stood in the house of God. Then in verse 43, and they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and children also rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. What's the emotion here? Joy. I think it's, 5 times just in verse 43, rejoicing or joy is made mention of. This is a big time occasion, right? This is a big event that they are able to come together and rejoice at the idea that God has allowed them to return and that He's allowed them to rebuild the wall. Okay. Now, look at verse 44. On that day, men were appointed over the storerooms, the contributions, the first fruits, and the tithes, to gather them into the portions required by the law for the priests and for the Levites, according to the fields of the towns. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and the Levites who ministered. And they performed the service of their God and the service of purification, as did the singers and the gatekeepers, according to the command of David and his son Solomon. For long ago, in the days of David and Asaph, there were directors of the singers, and there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. And all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah gave the daily portions for the singers and the gatekeepers, and they set apart that which was for the Levites, and the Levites set apart that which was for the sons of Aaron. So here's what you've got. You have people so excited, so thankful, so joyful over what's going on that they make sure that there are people who are appointed to make sure that the priests and the Levites and the singers get what they need for the service. They appoint people to oversee all of that. And I think you see that in verse 45. Let's see. The end of verse 44. Because Judah rejoiced over the priests and the Levites who ministered. I think the idea there is they had such joy over the fact they had priests and Levites to minister in a temple that they were willing to make sure that they were going to be taken care of, that there was going to be an accounting done, that people were giving what they were supposed to do this. Now, what's the basis? Where do they find the instructions for what they're supposed to be doing here? Look at the end of verse 45. Yeah, the command of David and Solomon. There are several times when we reference the singers, the musical stuff that's going on at the temple, and even some of the temple services, that it's what was commanded to David and even to Solomon that is referenced. We'll see that during the period of the kings, and we especially see it here during the period of the return. I think we see in that, at least in some way, like the principle of what we would think of as restoration. And what I mean by that is we are 600 years removed from David and Solomon at this point, right? We're a long way down the road. And still, when they try to decide what they're going to do at the temple, they don't just make it up when they get there. what they do is they go back and they look at what God had commanded David and Solomon. What God commanded David and Solomon was slightly more extensive than what he had commanded Moses with regards to the tabernacle. There was more, especially of a musical framework, there was more of that with the temple than there was with the tabernacle. It looks to me like with the tabernacle that God commanded Moses with those 2 silver trumpets, and that was it. Now, when David comes in, there's a lot more that he is able to put into place. But 500 years later, 600 years later, when they come back from captivity and they're trying to decide what the worship of the temple is going to look like, they don't just say, well, we'll get whoever we want to play whatever we want to whenever they want to. They go to the command of David and of Solomon. They go back a long way to make sure they know what they're supposed to be doing and make sure that it's pleasing to God. And so you have this in verse 47, or into verse 46, there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. We come back to that idea of giving thanks on this occasion. It's a very joyful moment. And then in verse 47, there's this note that they made sure that there were daily portions for the singers and gatekeepers, that they set apart what was for the Levites, and that the Levites made sure that they set apart what was for the priests. So you remember the way that would work. The people as a whole would bring 1/10 to the Levites, and the Levites would take 1/10 of what they had been given, and they would give that 10th to the priests. And so everybody's making sure that God's servants have what they need in this whole process. Okay, any thoughts through chapter 12? Okay. If you come up with something, that'd be perfectly fine to share. Okay. So chapter 13. Here we have another gathering. On that day, I take it to be that this is still the dedication of the wall day, right, where they're celebrating that. On that day, they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people. And it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, for they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. Now you would think we've already done this, haven't we? We've already gone through this. But I'm wondering if when this was done in Ezra, if it wasn't completely done, right? If it wasn't done to the full extent. I think really in Ezra, maybe there's a focus on the leadership who was married in with some of these other people. This is Ezra 10 verse 18. It says there were found some of the sons of the priests who had married foreign women. Verse 23, of the Levites and of Israel, there were some mentioned there. But I'm wondering if we're not talking about maybe some people in the leadership roles in those situations. And now the people are hearing this read. They hear the part about Ammon and Moab, and they say, we've got to make some separating here. And so maybe they had not been fully engaged in that. Any thoughts or questions about that? Maybe somebody else has a better idea than I do on that. And I will say this. It's possibly been 13 years since that happened. So you're talking about from 458 to 445. Who knows what kind of marriages took place in the middle, right? There might have been this effort on Ezra's part to clean up the marriages, the intermarriages between the people of Judah and the foreign women. And who knows what happened over 13 years with some of the people. Maybe even some of the people that had come back during that period of time. So those are various options out there.
Do you think there's any chance that they severed the marriages, but maybe some of the foreigners stayed there amongst Israel?
That's very possible, because you're right. Yeah, you're right, because it doesn't talk about marriages here specifically. It just talks about association, and especially them entering the court, the assembly of God. So I'm wondering if Ammonites and Moabites weren't just completely paired up with them even through all the temple services. So that's a good thing to point out, that the focus isn't marriages here. It's just their association. All right. So in chapter 13, there are 4 major issues that come up, and some of these will sound familiar to you. The first problem is that Eliashib, the priest, had made for Tobiah, right? We've talked about Tobiah already, had made for Tobiah a place to stay within the temple. Now, if I understand correctly, he's made him a sanctuary, a place to stay within the temple itself. Now, first thing you would say, in the temple? That's the question I have right now. In the temple, right? That's the first question. The second question is, an Ammonite? Because that's what it seems to be that Tobiah is. And third of all the Ammonites that are there, Tobiah, right? He's like the worst of them, right? So I think this just, when Nehemiah finds out about this, he's apoplectic, right? He can't believe how terrible this is. He's seriously angry. This is verse 9. Verse 8, and I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. So Tobiah, this wicked man, is staying there, and this is terrible, and so they want to get him out. All right, so that's the first problem. The second problem is that the portion for the Levites was being neglected. All right, so remember chapter 10, verse 39, they promised that they wouldn't neglect that. And then in verse 44, we see that again of chapter 11 or chapter 12, they were going to make sure it's taken care of. But at some point, it's not being taken care of. And so you've got them saying, I confronted the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And it seems to be that they make a correction on that. Verse 14, remember me, O my God, concerning this. The third problem is that they neglect the Sabbath, right? And remember in chapter 10, verse 31, they had signed that contract that said they would not violate the Sabbath. But that's what they're doing. They're coming in, they're buying and selling. And he says this in verse 19, as soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. Now the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice, but I warned them and said to them, why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. So you've got this third issue that's being addressed is the Sabbath day keeping. So they have to address that again. And then problem number 4 is foreign marriages. Now, let me just mention this. The contract that they signed in chapter 10, there were 3 key things that they were supposed to be concerned about. Foreign marriages, provision for the Levites, and the Sabbath day. It already all 3 of those things are going to show up. In addition to the fact that it's not just the foreign marriages, it's the thing with Tobiah in verses 4 through 9, which may reference the thing that we begin with at the beginning of the chapter. Now, it's very interesting. Look at this in verse 23. In those days, I also saw Jews who had married the women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. The issue, and we talked about this the other night when we talked about these intermarriages. I don't think that fundamentally the problem is the DNA genetic origin of these people. I think the problem is that these people are not leaving their old identity behind to become faithful Israelites. Because think about Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite. She gets to marry Boaz, and she becomes the grandmother of David, right? Great-grandmother, great-grandmother of David, right? So it's not about being a Moabite necessarily. It's about being a Moabite that doesn't leave Moabite ways. And that's the indication here, because the children, when they marry the people from Ashdod, what language do the children end up speaking? Ashdodian, right? They end up speaking the language of Ashdod. And the problem is that Israel, Judah, was supposed to be distinct. They were supposed to be distinct, and they're losing that distinctiveness, and that's the problem. So Nehemiah is going to address that. Now, so verse 30, thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work, and I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. And I think we do have God remembering him for good, because we have the book of Nehemiah been preserved for us. And so we can remember, not only does Nehemiah rebuild the wall, but he's very interested in the spiritual faithfulness of the people, and we see him addressing those problems. All right. We're almost out of time. Anybody have a quick comment? Yeah, he did. He sure did. That's right. I did. Yeah, verse 25. I didn't get to point that out. I was running out of time. Mr. Gerald gave me a 1-minute signal, and I was rushing. All right. Thank you very much for your kindness through Nehemiah. Lord willing, Sunday we'll work on the book of Malachi. So we'll be working on that.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.